Today is episode 5 with Dr. B.
Welcome to the Harness Your ADHD Power podcast. If you're looking for a fresh perspective and actionable steps on hot topics from focus to follow through to self-management and more, you are in the right place. Welcome your host, innovative educator, coach, and psychotherapist, Dr. B.
Hey there, ADDers. So glad that you could join me today for my 5th podcast episode. Today's episode is all about understanding Perfectionist Prison and the life sentence without parole that you might be giving yourself, rather than appreciating and celebrating the perfect moments and making conscious, rich memories from them. How much time do we have? Not much. So let's get to it. If you're a perfectionist, you probably know other perfectionists. You probably notice that perfectionistic tendencies tend to vary from person to person, whether these tendencies show up with people, places, or things. And what we all have in common, though, are these feelings of insecurity and the need for approval, whether that's the approval of others or of ourselves. We need to know that we are enough, that we are good enough. And in part, our perfectionist ways can lead to people-pleasing, or also called codependency, and other destructive behaviors. As a child perfectionist, I needed to copy and recopy my school notes over and over and over again until they looked pretty and legible. That's code for perfect. I remember spending hours and hours on them. I also needed to be the perfect kid so that I would hopefully get my needs met in the various relationships of my childhood. This was an exhausting way to live, and I was only a kid. As I got older, I watched my perfectionism connect with visual cues. I would notice that my environment didn't match the internal image that I had of the perfect room, and so I would need to make the room match that internal image. Now, this might be sounding a little OCD to some of you, and I'm sure that I had traits of that too as I was growing up. I noticed that when I didn't have an internal image of what was the perfect thing, whether it was my physical body or a paper that I was writing for school, I was really in trouble. I had this terrible feeling, this sense of uneasiness, that it wasn't perfect, that it wasn't finished yet, that it could still be better. Can you relate? When I couldn't identify what the perfect state was, I was doomed to continue to perfect it for an indefinite period of time. Could be days, could be weeks, could be months, could even be years, because there was no ability to stop at any given point and say that it was finished or perfect, because I didn't have an internal cue or image that would help me stop and wrap it up. In October of 1984, I wrote my bachelor's thesis. It was entitled The Psychology of Ideal Body Image as an Oppressive Force in the Lives of Women. For that assignment, I went back through the history of body image and I researched all the different perfect bodies over time. It's amazing the things that constituted being perfect at various times in history. Having a handspan waist was a prized possession, and only possible because women had their lower ribs removed so that they could be corseted into that handspan waist size. Being able to faint on command was admired at the time when women needed to be seen as frail and in need of male protection. Being stocky and physically strong to endure the early West and childbearing put these women in high demand. And so on and so on. You get the picture. What was considered perfect changed over time, depending on the cultural or societal needs. And since perfect was ever changing and perfection doesn't last, if you were hooked into the belief that you needed to be perfect, it could become a life sentence without the hope of parole ever. Women have been taken hostage and chased perfection for years now, and men have been taken hostage by similar needs. The road to being perfect can be paved with depression, anxiety, and even suicidal thoughts due to the inability to achieve perfection. This isn't an innocent condition. In fact, it can be fatal. If you're interested in the paper I wrote, I published it online, and you can access it from my website blog at drbarbaracohen.com. perfectionistexperience.com. Shifting gears here. I learned that the statement, start with the end in mind, has many important purposes. By starting with the end in mind, I had to create and have an internal picture of what the finished product or task looked like in my mind, so that when I got to that point, I could stop. What a great aha moment. Now I can pretty much stay out of the trap of perfectionism by starting with the end in mind. And if I can't see that end point, I ask others what they imagine or know that end point would look like. Now, mind you, their image isn't necessarily my image. However, this gives me something to work with to create my own image. And once I have that image, then I can get started with the project or the task because I know where it is that I'll be stopping. What a relief this has been for me. I had a very funny perfectionist experience years and years ago in a bookstore. I was looking at the book, The Spirituality of Imperfection, How Perfect, and the image on the cover is a vase with a crack in it. I thought that it was a crease in the cover of the book, and so I ended up looking at all the copies of the book on the shelf to try and find one that didn't have that imagined crease in it. It's really funny to look back now and realize just how important having the perfect book was when I purchased it, rather than one with a slight blemish or crease. In reality, there was no crease, and it's even funnier to me now because it's a book about the perfection of imperfection. Remember, there's no being the perfect parent, but there are perfect parenting moments. And there's no being the perfect husband or wife or life partner, but there are certainly perfect coupleship moments. And there's no being the perfect student, but there are perfect academic moments. These perfect moments are those moments in an experience where everything feels just perfect. And you might wish that that moment could last forever, and it can't. It's a moment in time, not a permanent state of being. And the only place that it can be permanent is in your memory. That's why I've made it a practice to collect conscious, memorable, perfect moments to reflect back on and make me feel just as good as when they actually took place. Most of us are so busy being busy, rushing from one thing to the next thing to the next thing, that we miss out on the richness of the actual experiences, and hence we keep running to the next thing to try to fill up the need for something satisfying. I remember learning this with food. I used to be a pretty fast eater. Heck, I'm still not a slow eater, but I've learned to slow down and be present for the experience of eating my food. Why? Because I could never get full when I ate fast. I wasn't satisfied, and the unsatisfied feeling was coming from how I was eating, not from the food. I was looking at the wrong issue. So I would go for more food and more food and more food and still not be satisfied. And I'm telling you, I could not understand how I could fit so much food inside of me and still not be satisfied. The point is, I needed more and more because I wasn't present to be grateful and satisfied. If you've been listening to any of my first 4 podcasts, you've heard me say that you are not what you do or don't do, that you are more than that. We are not defective or less than as people, as human beings. We're just wired differently, and the difference is actually pretty cool once you have a different perspective and the tools that you need for your own success. And it's my hope that you'll get some of those resources here. One of the reasons I started this podcast is to close the gap between what's known in research and academic circles and what gets out to all of you for your benefit. It's important that I share what I've learned over the course of my lifetime, because I don't want all this information just sitting around inside my head for my own benefit when it could benefit you too. I firmly believe that each and every one of you deserves a good life, however you define that, and especially when you're actively looking for help to achieve it. And since you're here listening to me, I'm assuming that you're looking for answers and help for whatever's holding you back or keeping you from the life that you want. I take my commitment to be of service seriously with this weekly podcast, even if I joke about things relating to adult ADHD. A sense of humor goes a long way to keep things in perspective. We're all in this together, community thinking, for the highest good of all of us. So remember, I'm a work in progress just like you. I've learned a lot about how to make the most of my gifts and quiet my challenges, and I trust that you will too. Just so you know, Every episode will have no more than 3 important points with relevant stories, an action step, and a favorite quote of mine. I hope you're as excited as I am with this format. Through the stories that I'll be sharing with you today, we're going to take a look at what perfectionism is, the driving force behind it, staying off the slippery slope into perfectionist prison, and making rich, memorable, conscious memories of the perfect moments instead. And remember, there's an action step towards the end of the episode, and that's for you. Because once you understand your perfectionistic traits, there's work to be done. You aren't off the hook here. Today's 3 important points are why you might feel the need to strive for perfection in all that you do, and what could be behind that driving force, and why perfectionism can keep you trapped if you don't define your perfect criteria before you start, and why making conscious memories of perfect moments can be a very satisfying alternative to perfectionist prison.
This podcast is sponsored by Pure Potential with Dr. B. You can head over to drbarbaracohen.com and find the podcast show notes, grade free content from Dr. B, plus programs and services. That's drbarbaracohen.com.
Now back to being an adult with ADHD in today's world. There's so many negative feelings that can get triggered when you're a perfectionist. Feelings of inadequacy, self-doubt, disappointment, or frustration, to name a few. And as I said earlier, there's so many reasons that people jump into perfectionist prison. You could work on trying to perfect everything in your life, which is an impossible task. Or you could go deeper to the underlying issues so that you can really understand the challenge and what you need to do to transform it into conscious, meaningful, perfect moments and memories. I'm going to share 3 stories with you today, as well as talk about your responsibility in this. That's right, your ability to respond, since you're not off the hook here. And I hope that at least one of these stories is going to resonate with you and be of benefit. So let's keep going. Larry didn't have much control when he was growing up, as is true for most kids. However, Larry's environment was really out of control. Between the alcoholism and the regular raging from one or both of his parents, his childhood was a really tough one. This contributed to his feelings of insecurity as a kid, which didn't really improve much into his adult life. And as with many highly creative or bright kids, Larry was able to figure out a way to survive his childhood and channel his insecurities into something that felt productive and satisfying. He had a talent for sculpting, and he loved the feel of the clay in his hands. It was a wonderful sensation. He was in complete control of what he created and how he wanted it to turn out. So this seemed like a really great thing, given Larry's history. I wish that had been the case. Instead, Larry's talents for sculpting were severely challenged by his perfectionistic nature. He would start a project and not like how it was going. He would try to rework the clay, and when he couldn't get it the way that he envisioned it, he would just trash it and start a new project. It didn't matter how many different projects Larry started. The same behavior patterns showed up over and over again, and they sabotaged his creativity. And it was really depressing and frustrating for Larry. It wasn't just perfectionism that was getting the best of him. It was also his ADHD and the memory issues that presented. And that was making it very difficult for him to hold on to the image of what he wanted to create long enough to actually create it. So as the image would fade from his memory, it got harder and harder for him to create the sculpture that he originally had envisioned. He couldn't take a picture of what was inside his head to refer to, so he just kept doing what it was that he'd been doing, despite running in circles and getting nowhere. Larry was so thoroughly frustrated with himself, and he just didn't know what to do to remedy these challenges. He was desperately looking for something to validate his self-worth and his purpose in life. He felt that if he could only produce something so amazing and so perfect, that he would receive the recognition that he was so desperately in need of. And since he could never achieve the perfection that he sought, and had connected his self-worth to what he did rather than who he was locked in Perfectionist Prison. Some background information. The motivation that drives perfectionism is typically a fear of failure rather than the drive to succeed. In an NLP frame of reference, it's a motivation style that has you moving away from rather than moving towards something. If your style is to move away from, you're doomed to repeat this pattern over and over and over again, because away from only moves you far enough away from the risk or the stressor to reduce that stress for the moment, and then you slide right back into the situation again, because nothing's changed. So if you're like Larry, and your sense of worth is determined by what you do, not who you are, hence then you become a human doing and not a human being. There's a lot of black and white or all or nothing thinking that accompanies perfectionism. It's perfect or it isn't. There's nothing else. And not being perfect implies failure. There's no celebration when a success or a win occurs, because after all, you're only doing what's expected of you, and that isn't a reason to get credit or praise. I address this issue in part in my mini course, The Magical Power of Wins, because no matter whether something is expected or not, it deserves self-praise and celebration. And the response to less than perfect is a heightened one, beyond what the situation actually warrants. This response can come from you or others who need you to be perfect, or both. You might be unwilling to answer a question for fear of giving the wrong answer. Can you relate? Rather than accepting that your answer is what it is, and it's what you currently understand, and that doesn't make you a failure. Larry's behavior is typical of perfectionists who repeatedly start tasks over and over again because the work has to be perfect as it unfolds and when it's finished, if it ever gets finished. This can fuel the lack of productivity that's seen both with perfectionists and those with ADHD. Eve was determined to make a good life for herself, the perfect life, as she referred to it. She knew so many of the things that she wanted in that perfect life: a nice house, a great relationship, maybe start a family, a career that was challenging and rewarding, a supportive circle of friends to socialize with, and the list went on and on. Now, this might sound like Eve had a really great plan for her life, and if you think that's the case, you need to think again. There were no steps or actual plans for the so-called plan that she had for this great life that she wanted. Yes, she was willing to work hard, to do whatever it was going to take to get where it is that she wanted to go, except for one problem. Where she wanted to go kept changing. Eve was trapped in the throes of choosing again, which was part of her perfectionism. She would get started with something that she had chosen, whether it was a job, a relationship, a project, or whatever. And along the way, she would decide that it wasn't what she wanted. It wasn't perfect. And so she would choose again and move on. This pattern continued on for years and years and left a trail of jobs and relationships and projects and friendships behind her. And because of how she left, which was pretty abrupt and without much consideration for others whose lives were touched by her decisions, she really couldn't go back to anything prior in her life. She had burned those bridges. It's not uncommon for adults with ADHD to choose again and again, both out of impulsivity as well as the lack of criteria for what they actually want to do. Some background information. The set of criteria that I'm referring to requires self-exploration to determine exactly what it is that you want. This can trigger self-doubt in the decision-making process, doubting that your choice is the best one available or the best one for you, or that perhaps there is a better choice still out there and you need to continue to explore and keep your options open. And until you make a decision that you're comfortable with and know that it's the right decision for you based on the criteria that you have for what you need to achieve or feel or experience via your decision, and commit to that decision, you will continue to choose again and again, and most likely continue on your quest for the perfect choice. George and Alice have been together for years, and they've been working towards having a great union for a very, very long time now. It's important to note that they're both perfectionists. It took a long time for them to plan their engagement, their wedding, and their life together because it needed to be perfect. And on several occasions, they rescheduled their engagement party and their wedding because it just wasn't going to be perfect. Perhaps they hoped that after they settled in and they were married, that their perfectionistic traits wouldn't be such a problem. However, the problems continued to escalate as time passed. Their marriage became a rocky one because of the judgment and negative thoughts that they each experienced about the other. Alice's perfectionistic traits were directed to George and in all the ways in which he wasn't perfect. He doesn't make the bed as perfectly as she does, or he doesn't load the dishwasher as perfectly organized as she does, or clean up after himself as perfectly as she wants him to. There's a hint of obsessive-compulsive traits going on here with Alice, as well as her ADHD. In fact, sometimes mild OCD traits can be useful for adults with ADHD, so long as they don't take over. Alice had lost sight of all the ways in which he was perfect for her, how he is so amazing as a person and partner in so many important ways. She's been letting all that she doesn't have overshadow all that she does have with George. And this continues to make Alice very unhappy in her marriage. And George is doing pretty much the same thing that Alice has been doing. He has his own ideal or perfect image of how he wants Alice to look and to respond to him. And when she doesn't respond in the ways that are perfect for him, he becomes non-responsive to her, which only fuels Alice's feelings of inadequacy and imperfection and drives her further inside herself and away from George. And then this fuels George's issues, and he ends up feeling that Alice is even less of the perfect woman for him. You know, he's lost sight of the loving and deeply caring woman he spent so many years with because the perfect ways of responding to him aren't being experienced. George's ADHD is different than Alice's, just as his perfectionism is different than hers. George felt he was focused on Alice and her needs, but he really couldn't see her clearly. Alice and George's conversations became very close-minded and controlling. After all, perfection is about control. Their approach is that they would give a little if they got what they need because they felt that they had the perfect right to get their needs met. Perfectionism had even crept into their conversations and communication patterns. They have moved to a place of speaking about feelings of entitlement rather than gratitude or compassion. Both George and Alice are in the throes of Perfectionist Prison, where they have locked out the good and locked in the bad. And since what you focus on grows, what's been growing is the dissatisfaction that they each feel towards the other, rather than the gratitude and appreciation for all that they have that's amazing. Your mind gets trained by you to seek perfection and to suffer when you don't achieve it. Perfection is different than wanting to be your best or achieve the best. Perfection is a must-have instead of a prefer-to-have. It takes great ingredients to produce great results, and poor ingredients can't get you the great results. George and Alice were definitely using poor ingredients to build their life together. They were truly blind to the negativity that they were each generating. You know, many people say that they want a better life, but most aren't willing to do what it takes to have the better life that they want. And if they really are, they might not see what needs doing to make their life better. Some action steps. It's your responsibility to get the information and training that you need. In other words, your ability to respond to your needs and to meet them. So if you're like Larry and you have personal control issues, you might focus on your black and white thinking patterns and ask yourself questions that will show you that it isn't all or nothing, that there are exceptions. You might follow through with what you can do and learn about your capabilities through taking action and reinterpret your outcomes without the black and white, all or nothing thinking. See the gray. And with self-management of your emotions while you're working through your black and white thinking, learn to be able to tolerate the mild or even more intense distress that you might experience as you challenge your absolute perfectionistic thinking. If you're like Eve and you constantly find yourself choosing again, you're going to need to close all of those exits and insist that you do not choose again on a whim and stay committed to your decision or your choice. You need to focus on determining what you really want. Really take time to consider this question rather than what's quick and easy to get or to shift to. To follow through on what you've decided and learn what it's like to stay with a decision, as well as know that you've made a good decision for yourself. In self-management of your emotions, it's particularly important with the issue of choosing again. You might feel trapped or scared or uncertain, and you need to be gentle with yourself and your feelings as you stay with them and learn what they're telling you beyond the actual feeling itself. If you're like George and Alice and both have ADHD and perfectionistic traits, focus on being open-minded and discovering why you're so locked into judgment or negativity and how that's serving you. Then follow through on seeing more than what you don't have and make a conscious effort to do so. And with self-management, it might be that you need to cultivate compassion and gratitude, both for yourself and the other, and knowing that the perfectionist in you needs to be taught and conditioned to see and feel differently, rather than expecting that it's going to happen overnight. A favorite quote. Brene Brown said, "Understanding the difference between healthy striving and perfectionism is critical to laying down the shield and picking up your life. Research shows that perfectionism hampers success. In fact, it's often the path to depression, anxiety, addiction, and life paralysis." The question I have for you at this point of our journey together is, what shield of perfectionism do you need to lay down so that you can fully embrace and live your life? I appreciate you showing up to listen today and in the future. New episodes are available once a week on Mondays at 12 noon Pacific Time. I'll be talking about such compelling topics as analysis paralysis, catastrophic thinking, stress reduction, compulsions, addictions, making friends, managing yourself within time, and more hot topics, as well as lining up guests to bring more great insights to you. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast and keep coming back. In fact, if you receive value today, please rate the show and write a thoughtful review on iTunes so I know that I'm meeting your needs. It means a lot to me to know that your life is getting a little bit better every time that we get together. And remember to subscribe so that you receive every new episode as soon as it's available. And then be sure to get over to my website to get your show notes and learn about other services. That is, if that's of interest to you. Thanks for listening. Until the next time. Bye.
Thanks for your undivided attention. If you're hungry to make positive changes in your life, head over to drbarbaracohen.com and see how Dr. B can help you today. Whether you love making changes with one-to-one attention and community support, or on your own with self-study, or could benefit from coaching or psychotherapy, you'll find all the information right there at drbarbaracohen.com.